Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. So happy you're here and have joined us today. Today's webinar is Lessons in Paradise, Invasive Plant Prevention and Management in Florida. So you may have noticed your microphones have been muted. Please put any questions you have in the chat box and we'll take them at the end of the presentation. And if you feel like it, go ahead and put in the chat box your least favorite invasive plant, your how do you say that, your pet peeve invasive plant. I think mine is probably Mexican petunia. I just see it everywhere, and every time I see it, it drives me crazy. I also want to let you know that this webinar is approved for one CEU from FNGLA, FFLCP, the Landscape Architects, DBPR, and also LIAF. Sorry about that. There is a $10 administration fee to receive a certificate of continuing education, and I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat box a little later in the presentation. We will submit the CEUs on Friday, so it'll be a couple days before you get your CEU certificate, and we do that to allow people a chance to go ahead and register for the CEU after the webinar is over. This is part of a monthly webinar series held on the second Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. The next one are Things Are Looking Up, Vines, Hanging Baskets, and Other Vertical Elements with Robert Bowden. We're also offering a Green Stormwater Infrastructure webinar series in partnership with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and Ferguson Waterworks. We'll be having our last webinar in that series on November 2nd. And it's Green Stormwater Infrastructure, Lessons Learned and Roundtable. And that is also approved for CEUs. It's 1.5 CEUs from FNGLA, Landscape Architecture, and also PE licenses. And at the end of this, you'll also see a survey invitation pop up. If you don't mind, please take a moment to fill this out, as it really helps us determine what kind of educational programming we're going to offer in the future. And we are currently putting together our 2024 webinar lineup. So we'd really appreciate your input into that. And with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Claire. I appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. As I'm looking at the chat, I'm seeing all these horrible invasive plants being listed. It's a scary situation. And so I'm so glad that you're here joining us today. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker, Christian Wanamaker. Christian's a master's student interested in botany and ecology, especially in understanding the distributions of invasive species and their impacts. His research looks at how native and invasive grasses are responding to heat and drought stress and how these stressors may constrain their distributions. Christian has also worked on the IFAS Assessment of non-native plants since 2018. Today, Christian's going to provide a presentation on invasive plant prevention and management in Florida. So it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Christian Wanamaker. Take it away, Christian.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this. It's always exciting to talk about the research that we do at the assessment. Obviously, the topic of invasive plants gets a pretty hot topic in Florida because we have so many invasive plants here, and there's always something new to be learned. We're always trying new management and prevention techniques to try to mitigate the impacts of invasive plants in Florida. So, excuse me. That is broadly the topic that I'll be discussing today. First of all, I am going to go through the terminology and some definitions that I'm going to be using for invasive species. I think it's pretty important to get that clear in the beginning of any kind of discussion about invasive species. Then I'm going to move through an introduction of the invasion process, right? How non-native species become invasive. We'll have a discussion about the negative impacts of invasive species. I'll talk briefly about how invasive species are responding to ongoing climate change situations. And then kind of the bulk of the talk and the interesting bit, in my opinion, is the tools for management, prediction, and prevention of invasive plants in Florida. So obviously, before we go further, I think it's generally helpful to go over definitions and terminology. I think the language that we use around the topic of invasive species it can be kind of contentious, and it can also be kind of confusing. So I'll be adhering to terminology that's been developed and used by the Invasive Species Council. And the first thing that I want to discuss and define is, what native species are. Native species are those that occur naturally within a specified geographic area. These have been historically present in that area, and they are going to have a shared evolutionary history with other species in that area. Then, in contrast, we have non-native species, right? And these are species that don't occur naturally within your specified area. Their introduction is attributable to human activity. And again, they wouldn't have been here historically, and they don't have this shared evolutionary history with other organisms in the area. And that's not just plants, but also, I should mention, animals, microbes, pathogens, etc. Established species, and especially in plant literature, we see the term naturalized pretty often. These are species that are non-native, and they have formed self-sustaining and reproducing populations. Reproductive is what I was going for. And then finally, the real meat and potatoes, we have invasive species. And invasive species, importantly, are a subset of non-native species that we know to be spreading, and that their presence is likely to cause, or we're observing, environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. So I want to just point out just a couple of examples, thinking about as far as non-native species, we might talk about something like an apple, right? Apples have been brought to the United States through human activity, obviously a very important agronomic and economic crop, but there's no evidence that it's going to become invasive, right? There's no documented impacts. It's not spreading wildly across its range. And so that's why it's important to take away from this that not all non-native species are invasive. Generally, this process is followed for how non-native plants go to becoming, from a harmless garden plant, it seems, to becoming an invasive plant. And typically, we like to use these stages of invasion to help conceptualize that process. The first stage of this is this transport stage, right, where there has to be some kind of pathway along which a species is moved, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. And it's being moved from where it's naturally distributed or found into a new area. The second stage here is introduction, and this is very closely related to transport, but it focuses on the specific introduction event versus the existence of a transport pathway. That third stage, establishment, once a species is present, it has to have the ability to successfully establish and to produce reproductive populations. After that, we get into the spread stage, this fourth stage, and that is where once these populations are present, they have begun to move or spread throughout the landscape and establish brand new populations still. And then that final stage is really what most people think about when we're talking about invasive species, and that's that impact stage. And that's due to either traits of the species itself or to the dense populations that it may be able to form. The species is beginning to demonstrate negative impacts within that introduced region. So I just want to, focusing piece by piece on these stages of invasion, talking about transportation and the increase in transportation that we're seeing globally. You can see from this figure kind of just how interconnected we are globally. Those light colored lines are flight paths. There's sort of harder to see blue lines that indicate shipping paths. And within the continents, you can see green lines, which are like highways and road systems. Obviously, this is a relatively novel phenomenon, right? In the past 50 years, we're seeing just this tremendous increase of interconnectivity, and also this reduction in the amount of time it takes to get from point A to point B. And as the world is becoming increasingly globalized and connected, the available pathways for species introductions have also expanded. And kind of as we would expect, we're seeing invasive species as a growing global problem along with that increase in connectivity. And this is just a quick figure that you can see. Obviously, we're focused mostly on the vascular plants, which is in the bottom left here. But you can see that they really begin to take off in the late 1800s. And there's no real sign that the rate of introductions is declining. So this is not like an issue that's in the past. We're not at all in the rearview mirror here. We are actively looking at a worsening situation when it comes to the introduction of invasive species. Florida, however, is kind of unique. And I think it's important to kind of contextualize how Florida fits into this. So Florida has a subtropical, tropical climate. There's a degree of environmental gradient, or is an environmental gradient. because Florida has such a long and unique geography. And so we have a bunch of different climate types, and these climate types are sort of unique from the rest of the United States, but match with a lot of biogeographic regions across the world, which means that the species that can be introduced to Florida are species that maybe couldn't be introduced elsewhere. We also are something of a tourism and trade hotspot, right? I have a few numbers here that some 85% of all non-native species move through the ports of Florida. Some $80 billion of cargo arrive every year, and an average of 120 million tourists visit Florida annually. And just to kind of highlight again the quantity of non-native species that are moving through trade, or I should say arriving in Florida through trade, we have some 1,400 plus non-native species in our flora compared to 2,400 native plants in our flora. So you can see just how much of a component the non-native element of our flora is. So the pathways for introduction are broken down into both intentional and unintentional pathways. So we might be introducing species for horticultural or agricultural purposes. Again, we talked about apples a moment ago. That would be an example of intentional introduction, where we're importing a plant to grow it for economic purposes. We also have erosion control and wildlife improvement. An example of a plant that we imported for this reason would be kudzu, which is sort of notorious nowadays as an invasive species that had escaped. But originally, right, it was introduced to stabilize soils and control erosion. And then as far as accidental imports, we have a couple just examples here. Unprocessed shipping materials. Historically, shipping containers used to be lined with materials like organic materials like hay, for example. And there are examples of invasive plant propagules coming through in that hay. And that would be an idea of unprocessed shipping materials. And we also have this idea of hitchhikers. And a lot of plants have seeds or other propagules that have adaptations to either cling to clothing or to cling to heavy machinery. And these will then get carried a pretty substantial distance away. And this is how they can establish new populations. But again, just important to note that we have both intentional and unintentional pathways for introduction. Another example of a historical introduction in Florida, right? We have water hyacinth. Water hyacinth is, I mean, most of us are probably very familiar with this, but they're native to South America, but were introduced in the late 1800s again as an ornamental into Florida. Within a couple of decades, we can see that it was introduced into Florida's waterways. It must have escaped from gardens, and it began to form a major impediment for waterway travel. And for this reason, water hyacinth is actually one of the first invasive plants that we have evidence for active control efforts in Florida. And keeping on this trend of introduction, it's important to note that a lot of these introductions, especially when it comes to invasive woody plants, they're being moved intentionally by humans, and for the most part, they're linked to imports that are tied to either ornamental plant trade, forestry, or agriculture. So these are just examples of really well-intentioned but deliberate non-native species introductions and how they do contribute to the majority of those woody plant invasions. Moving on to the next stage of the invasion process here, climate matching and establishment. There are many factors that influence establishment, but what might be the most important is climate matching. So we have these lines indicating kind of the general climatic zones of the contiguous United States, and you can see just how much of the world kind of lines up with these zones, and including some very, very biodiverse regions. And just to kind of highlight this, if I superimpose this map of the distribution of an invasive plant, this is Mimosa or Albizia gibberellum. It's native to South Central Asia, and you can see the distribution there. But it also has these hot spots of distributions in Europe and also in the United States. And you can kind of just take from this that there's climatic suitability both in the United States and in Europe. And in both of those cases, in most countries in Europe and in the United States, this plant is considered not just introduced, but also invasive. Another factor that influences the ability of plants to become established is kind of what traits they have and how they access their resources. So plants which are considered specialists, maybe they require a specialist pollinator like this fig. The fig is only pollinated by a specific species of wasp, and that wasp isn't found in the introduced range. So that makes it really less likely to become invasive because it's lacking that specialist requirement. Compare this with a generalist species like this wisteria on the right. And wisteria, not only are they able to self-pollinate, and they're pollinated by just a variety of insects, there's not one specialist. Also, as a legume, it's capable of fixing its own nitrogen, and it's adapted to a wide range of shade and high sunlight situations. So it just lacks these general, or it lacks the specific requirements that might not be met in the introduced range, which makes it much more likely that it's going to become invasive. Some other traits that we know are affiliated with both establishment, but especially with spread, are the short time to reproduction. Think about annual plants that can complete their life cycle from germination to reproduction in the course of just a single year. Likewise, high seed production. There's an example here on the bottom right, and also you have Brazilian pepper and melaleuca. You can see just the amount of seed that these plants can put off. They also, traits that are affiliated or associated with efficient seed dispersal are also going to be advantageous for becoming, for spreading invasive plants. And again, we mentioned like those hitchhiking seeds that have those adaptations to catch on to either fur or clothing or lawn equipment. And then we also have vegetative spread. So these plants that can be chopped up or tilled, or just maybe in the attempt of doing mechanical control, we're dividing this plant up and it can spread with these very small propagules, thinking about things here like grasses that have rhizomes or stolons that can get moved very easily vegetatively and produce brand new plants. Next, I want to focus in on some of the negative impacts of biological invasions. I'm going to bring back just this definition of invasive species to remind you that there are three main components here of the impacts, and we can have impacts to either environmental systems, we can have economic impacts, and we can also have impacts to human health. So just as some examples of ecosystem or ecological impacts, we can have changes in water and nutrient cycling. Examples of this include eucalyptus, which in South Florida, some of you may know, it has a very high demand for water, and it can increase transpiration rates, and that alters the local hydrology of the invaded region. And we also have other examples when it comes to nitrogen fixers, lead tree, was it acacia? I forget, it's an acacia. And it is able, again, to fix its own nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into the soil, which can affect community composition and how nitrogen moves through the system. We also have altered disturbance regimes. In that top picture, we're seeing melaleuca again, which can pose a major fire threat in ecosystems. Basically, these trees move into these ecosystems which are adapted to regular low-intensity fires. And because of this increase in biomass in the system, and it's flammable biomass, it can change the intensity and the frequency of those fires. So that's an example of an altered disturbance regime. We also have species that are very effective at competing for resources. So in that bottom picture, we have Lagodium, Japanese climbing fern, which has climbed over probably cypress trees in this picture. And you can see in this example that the Lagodium, not only is it competing for sunlight and blocking the sunlight that's reaching the trees, it's also competing for physical space, and it's creating this layer in the ecosystem that wouldn't be present there otherwise with this smothering action and growth. And all of these things overall can result in the reduction of native species. We also know that there's the economic impacts of invasive species. And again, I can talk about the direct costs and the indirect costs of invasive species. Those direct costs, as an example, are the costs to recreation, agriculture, and ecosystem services that we might lose. Example of this, not a plant, but plant adjacent, is citrus greening, which has resulted in yield losses over $1.7 billion over the course of 5 years. And then as examples of indirect costs, we have the expense that it takes to manage these invasive plants. Not only are they causing direct impacts, we also are managing them, and the management activities cost as well. Plant management in Florida is estimated to be about $43 million per year. This graph on the right, we have some of the expenditures for controlling invasive plants in Florida, and you can see the top 5 are pretty notorious, awful invaders, and that's money that we wouldn't otherwise have to spend for these management activities. And we also have impacts to human health. This is sort of a dramatic example. This is giant hogweed. We don't have giant hogweed present in Florida, but it's just such a charismatic example of human health impacts. So giant hogweed, if you're unfamiliar, is from Southwest Asia, and it's naturalizing in more northeastern areas of North America. And it has this sap that contains toxins that can cause severe dermatitis. And this sap will actually, in contact with sunlight and skin, create this really awful rash with these blisters. And there's actually evidence that people have been like temporarily or even permanently blinded by them touching their eyes with this sap. And you might be wondering, like, why would we import, something like this in gardening? But it's considering, like, look at the picture of the person who's treating this plant. You can see it's kind of a stately, large plant with these massive leaves. It has these large, interesting flowers that are reminiscent of like carrots or hemlock, right, which is another problematic plant. And this was introduced to Britain as an ornamental curiosity in the 19th century, and then from there was introduced to the United States and Canada as this like showpiece in public gardens. So here's a few pictures of kind of the progression of that rash. You can see from the giant hogweed, the purple scarring that's even left after 5 months of it. So it's just very like, yeah, you don't want to mess with this plant. And this is a pretty severe example, but there are other examples of impacts to, say, allergy-causing plants, or just actual poisonous plants. And you can think about plenty of examples of plants that are poisonous either to people or to cattle or other livestock. And I want to take just a moment to discuss climate change and how climate change is interacting with different elements of this invasion process. So the first point, right, we have more extreme weather events, and this can affect the dispersal and spread of invasive species, right? It creates more opportunities, say, with a flood event, for water-dispersed seeds to be reaching further. The second point here, melting sea ice opening new shipping routes. This opens new pathways. Think back to that like first image that I had about connectivity, and think about how those paths might change as we have new opportunities for maybe more direct travel between locations. And as those new pathways open up, the amount of time it takes to get from point A to point B changes, the direction of goods might change, and the species that move with them might also change if they're, coming from different places and moving to other new places. That third point, thinking about kind of changes in seasonality and the timing of life cycles and the phenology of plants. As an example for this, you might have plants that, invasive plants that'll be flowering earlier in the year and flowering sooner than native plants. And in that way, it could be competing for pollinators or just could reproduce in advance of native species and outcompete them. Another example that we have is this increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Something that I only recently learned about is that as you have plants that opportunistically take up this higher level of CO2, they have an increased incidence of herbicide resistance in some of these invasive plants. That affects some of our management techniques for these plants. And then finally, this is actually more what my research focuses on, is how changes in climate, including these the climatic filtering effects of climate matching on plant conditions and their requirements, are changing relative to temperature, humidity, rainfall, etc. And this can also affect what species are able to tolerate Florida's climate. And it also opens the door to range shifts, where the distributions of species might change with changing climatic suitability. To highlight this example, we have some recent research being done with Brazilian pepper, another invasive shrub that we are dealing with in Florida. Right now, the distribution of Brazilian pepper is limited mostly to South Central Florida and coastal regions. It's kind of creeping upward, with also patches in Texas and I think also California. But this shrub is, for the most part, restricted by frost and hard freeze events. And as winter temperatures are increasingly mild and these hard freezes are becoming less frequent and less intense, we're seeing that there's a creep in the habitat suitability northward for this plant. So while right now we're only concerned about it in Florida and say Texas, you can see in the future under like a 6-degree warming scenario, we might be really concerned about this well up into areas of South North Carolina and the interior of Louisiana. So you can see just how range shifts with climate change are a major issue that we're trying to anticipate. Moving on from that invasion process, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the tools that we have moving forward. This is the future-looking element, the tools that we have for prediction and management. As I get into that, I'm going to introduce this invasion curve. This is kind of a classic example. I'm sure, again, a lot of you have probably seen this as well. If I'm going to walk you through it very quickly, at the x-axis, you can see that we have time. So as we move left to right, we're moving forward in time. And on the y-axis, we have a double y-axis. We're looking at both increases in area invaded and increases in management cost. Importantly, I want to focus on this early section here. It starts before the entry of a non-native species or a potential invasive species, where we can have surveillance activities and prevention activities to try to prevent plants that we suspect might be problems from even being introduced in the first place. And that kind of activity extends even once that plant has been introduced. It can be introduced, it can start causing problems as time goes on, and we move into this eradication phase, where eradication is still a feasible management outcome, right? It's got a limited distribution. It's not super expensive for us to do a localized eradication if we know that it's there and we know that it's a problem, and if we have the management techniques to manage it. But moving past that, we get into this containment stage where you can't get rid of this plant at this point. It's no longer really feasible, whether that's due to the area invaded or the management costs or both. And as time goes on, we then move into this control management stage where you can't even exclude this from areas. You're looking at like spot treatments of things. Thinking about like a example of this, you can imagine Melaleuca in South Florida. We're in that control management stage. We're never going to be able to eradicate this with our current ability of like our current management techniques. And so instead, we might do things like remove it from residential areas where we're afraid that the fire hazard posed by Melaleuca could cause property damage. Focusing on specific kinds of management strategies. On the forefront, right, we have these prevention efforts, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about because that's a lot of what we do at the IFAS assessment. And these early detection rapid response efforts. This is in this prevention eradication stage where we are able to, either before or shortly after a species is introduced, anticipate that it'll become invasive and respond to it appropriately. And then we have these more traditional control strategies. We have mechanical control, right, which is just the physical removal of biomass. Chemical, we go out and spray it. Biocontrol, the introduction of organisms to reduce biomass or interrupt the plant's reproduction cycle, or there's a number of different ways biocontrols can work. And then integrated pest management, which is kind of just a combination of all of these different factors. But focusing on that early point of the curve, right, how do we stay ahead of that curve? How do we stay in that prevention and early detection rapid response position? And this is the shameless plug, right? This is what the IFAS assessment does. The IFAS assessment has 3 different tools that we use to evaluate the risk of plants becoming invasive. The first tool is a predictive tool that we have. I'll talk about each one of these in the following slides in a little bit more detail, but the first tool is this predictive tool, which is intended to evaluate the risk of a species becoming invasive before it even enters the state. We have the status assessment, which is more to diagnose what's going on with species that are currently present in the state. And then this infra-specific taxon tool, which is mostly an internal UF tool to evaluate cultivars of species and make sure that they're not going to be problematic. The predictive tool is a risk assessment protocol. It's been modified for Florida. It's based off of an Australian model, which is kind of the golden standard across the world right now. We use it to evaluate species that are new to the state or are known to cause problems elsewhere. It's largely a literature review tool, and we have a series of 49 questions that address these different areas, including histories of domestication, its current distribution, life history, traits, dispersal mechanisms, etc. In our database, we have over 200 species evaluated, and we add to this every year. Just as an example of something that's come up recently and been listed, this is now a Florida noxious weed. This is Vitex rotundifolia or beach Vitex. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. We also have the status assessment, like I said, which is for evaluating non-native species in our landscape, which are currently present and have potential for invasion. Like I said, this is more of a diagnostic tool. We complete these assessments with the input that we get from extension agents and land managers and other scientists that are working in the field. And it's important to note that we can have different conclusions by state zone. The ITP, I think, is kind of beyond the scope of this right now. Again, we're just looking at the invasion risk posed by cultivars that are being produced. And I want to point out just quickly, this is the website that we are currently using. We have over 900 species that are assessed across those 3 different tools. You can filter by conclusion, zone, growth form, whether you want to look at grasses or shrubs or just things that are pertinent to North Florida or South Florida. and you can also download these lists. Quickly, again, you can look either by a specific species. You can go ahead and view all the assessments that are down there, and you can always access the whole assessments tab up at the top bar. The Contact Us also allows you to go ahead and request a species assessment if you have something that's not on our website. Showing you, this is kind of what one of these assessment pages look like. You can see we have information about the species as we assessed it. We have assessment dates. A lot of these assessments are done repeatedly over time, especially when it comes to status assessments, to make sure that anything that we're kind of hesitant about, we're keeping an eye on and monitoring and reevaluating with time. And at the bottom left, you can see the different conclusions, and you can see this is an example where the conclusions are split up by zones. So this Clerodendron species in North Florida is not considered a problem species, but in Central and South we're a little bit concerned. And so that's why it's gotten that caution. The status assessment and for specific taxon conclusions are going to follow the same kind of format. You have invasive, caution, or non-problem species. But when you move on to the predictive tool, the conclusions are a little bit different. So we have this high invasion risk, moderate risk, and we're going to continue to evaluate, and low invasion risk. This is important because these high invasion risk plants, master gardeners and other volunteers, you have faculty and staff cannot recommend the use of these plants. When it comes to these moderate risk evaluate plants, they can be used, but you need to kind of put that disclaimer out there that maybe this is something you should stay potted, or you should be careful with this, keep an eye on it, control it in the landscape. And that thing that pose low invasion risk, we're not very concerned about. I'm going to kind of fly through these because we already know, I think, a lot of these invasive plants. We have air potato. This was introduced both for crop production and as a horticultural plant, but now it has escaped, and it causes these massive infestations and also smothers native vegetation. Water hyacinth, we also already talked about, introduced via aquaculture and escaped and can clog waterways. Japanese climbing fern was again introduced as a horticultural novelty, and also it reproduces vegetatively very easily. So it was also spread via garden waste, or I should say poor disposal methods. And Brazilian pepper tree also introduced as a horticultural species and known for producing these like copious amounts of seeds and forming these really, really dense thickets that can exclude native species. A couple of emerging invaders. We have beech videx, right, which I mentioned very briefly earlier. Initially, it was introduced for horticulture, but it was also promoted for dune restoration. The seeds are water dispersed, and it can impact ground nesting birds and sea turtle nesting sites. It's also very difficult to control. We also have this Eggers nutrush. It was also introduced horticulturally and spread as a garden waste disposal issue. Currently, it's found in these aquatic settings like swamps and cypress domes in Florida. It can form these dense stands, which you can kind of make out in this right-hand picture, and we expect it to cause long-term alterations to our ecosystems. This is currently an EDRR, early detection response target species. Horticultural species that we're concerned about recently, we have Epipremnum aureum, right? We know this is pothos. It's a pretty common houseplant, but it's also a vigorous climber, and we're seeing it pop up not only in South Florida, which is where I think it traditionally had been, but it's moving kind of northward and causing a lot of issues. We're also a little bit concerned about this congener Epipremnum pinnatum, which exhibits a lot of the same behaviors. I do want to focus though on some positive sort of stories here. These are some species that have come out as low risk and that we can recommend for landscaping purposes. This is pink cassia, or Cassia bakeriana, and it's an attractive small stature tree that can be used in ornamental plantings. Another example of a plant that we are green lighting for, it's just a low risk species, is this Japanese blueberry tree, Eleocarpus decipiens. So this has been evaluated and came out as a low risk. I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but it is very confusing. I wanted to at least address the existence of so many different lists for listing non-native plants, whether that's the federal noxious weed list, the state noxious weed lists, the lists, I guess you could call it that the assessment put out, the list that Florida Invasive Species Council, formerly Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, used to put out. And it's difficult to navigate all those lists. This is a good EDIS document. I understand now it's called Ask IFAS. But you can access this document and it'll explain the differences between all those different lists. Also, if there's any kind of remaining confusion, always feel free to reach out to us and to ask, and we can be a resource for that as well. With that, that's what I had to say. As I said earlier, please feel free to visit our website. It's kind of the whole point of the program is keeping everything publicly accessible and available, and trying to keep everyone updated with the best conclusions we have. And that being said, please feel free to email me. This is my personal email with any questions you might have. But thank you.
Christian, thank you so very much. Great information. And, it's really important that we understand more about invasive plants and invasive species, and, trying to avoid some of these problems that we've seen. A couple of questions that have come across while you were talking. Is mimosa invasive?
Mimosa, and the mimosa tree that I use as my example, Albizia julibrissin, yes, that is a problematic species, yes.
And, and obviously they can look that up on the IFAS assessment site. And if they ever have any questions, that's, a good place. I see that Jennifer has put up the link to the IFAS assessment. So Jennifer, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I should say, when it comes to, if you're curious about species, feel free to look at the page. And I showed you kind of a screen cap of what the species profile looks like on our website. But I should also mention that usually we have embedded links to PDF forms of those assessments. So there's a little bit more detailed information if you want to go in and look specifically at why we got to those conclusions.
All right. Would it be appropriate to burn invasive plants from your yard? And what's the best way to dispose of invasive plants?
So as far as burning, it's kind of a difficult question to give you a just broad response to, right? I don't want to encourage you, if you're living in a small residential area, right, with an HOA, to go out and set fire to your lawn. If you have a large amount of acreage and that's something that you're comfortable doing, I know that there are resources through the Forest Service at the state and federal level who can assist you with those kinds of things, but I'm not the right person to connect you to those resources. Definitely use caution if you're trying to burn things. It's more in native ecosystems where fires are, depending on the invasive plant, a really useful tool for management. In residential settings, I'd be a little bit more cautious.
Definitely, and that's excellent advice. Just to piggyback on that one, does the assessment recommend control techniques?
So we aren't really management focused. We really focus on that prevention and kind of prediction side of things. If you're looking for management recommendations, you're better off checking with the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. They do a lot of work with control methods, and they'll put out recommendations for how to control certain species. I think also there was a question about disposing garden waste. One of the big things that we will caution people against doing is if you compost, especially your garden waste, and you have a plant that you think is invasive, you don't really want to compost it, because there's a good chance if it spreads vegetatively, it can pop up through your compost pile and just get spread the next time you pot up plants or whatever. So the best way to probably dispose of those is put them in your regular garbage, and you want to make sure that they're bagged up and they're not going to escape from your garbage.
Fantastic. Can you address prohibited plants? Is there, basically the way I would see it is prohibited plants are those that have been deemed invasive by the IFAS assessment and by the state and are no longer eligible for sale.
Right. So we don't really give things the title prohibited. If we have prohibited on our website, it's an artifact of the fact that it's been prohibited by a regulatory agency. So we're not the ones who give those conclusions. We just kind of pass it along. But you're right. If it's a prohibited plant, it's been prohibited by a regulatory agency, and you're not allowed to sell it. You're not allowed to disperse it, or else you could face, legal penalties.
Fantastic. I see a question popped up. Susan was asking whether sunshine mimosa is a concern. That's a native ground cover.
No, Mimosa strigolosa. No, I believe that's still considered a low risk plant and a native. It's a native plant, so it wouldn't even do a predictive assessment for it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people effectively using that in their landscape. So, and that should be fine. And The chase tree, our Vitex, again, not an issue.
I believe chase tree is a non-native. I should look these things up before I just give you this information. Chase tree is a non-native, but I'm pretty sure that's a low risk species that's frequently used in landscaping. I also want to talk just for a second when you mentioned, Mimosa striolosa, the sunshine mimosa, the ground cover. It may be a native species, but it doesn't preclude it from being a weed, right? Like it can be growing in a situation where you don't want it, and that can certainly make it weedy, and you might want to control it. But that's not an invasive plant, right? Just because it's a weed doesn't make it invasive. Think about that definition that we use for invasive plants. A really core component is that they have to be non-native.
Fantastic. Good. One person noted that they've seen the native porterweed appears to have hybridized. Seems like it's more upright now than it used to be. Could this hybrid potentially be invasive?
I'm sorry, you said it was a non-native. Did you mention the species?
It was a native porterweed.
Oh, porterweed. I know that we have a native, and I know that we have a non-native. I am not aware of any hybrid potential.
I haven't seen it
specifically. Kind of the archetypical example, like hybridization is definitely a concern, right? We talk about lantana is the species we talk about typically with hybridization concerns. We have the native Lantana depressa, and it hybridizes with the introduced Lantana camara. And obviously, because of that hybrid potential, there's that interest in breeding non-invasive Lantana camara. It's kind of a mess. I actually don't know the status of Lantana camara cultivars, if we have any that are safe for landscape planting. But yeah, hybridization is definitely a concern. I'd have to look specifically into the porterweed situation.
Awesome. Is Melaleuca as serious a problem as it used to be? That they recall that there was some biocontrols being studied. Have those been put in place?
Yeah, I know for certain about one biocontrol. I unfortunately don't know the name of it because I'm not an entomologist. I just remember learning briefly about it. I think that they help with defoliation and they help with reducing the amount of seed that's released. But I mean, Melaleuca is still everywhere in South Florida. Even if you're helping to reduce the reproduction of it, if you have established trees, they're still going to pose a risk in the landscape, especially for fire or what have you. My understanding is that that is not a species we are aiming to eradicate. We don't have the means to do that right now.
Awesome. For species that have been evaluated, to be invasive, is there an effort to make it illegal to sell them?
There is a process to get these plants listed with either state or federal agencies, usually at the state level. It's not a very well-defined process. We do sometimes go ahead and petition. That's what it's a petition process to get things listed as noxious weeds. So an example of that would be that beach Vitex, right? That was a plant that we saw that we were concerned about. Dia actually went ahead and did the assessment on it, saw that it was high risk. And she then was able to petition the state of Florida to get that listed at the state level as a noxious weed. So yes, it does happen. It's kind of a case-by-case basis, though. There's not like a regular mechanism to do that automatically, no.
All right. A couple of people noted that burning certain plants can be problematic, like Brazilian pepper, poison ivy, things like this. So just certainly be cautious before you ever think about burning anything.
I would recommend that if you're going to do that, definitely reach out to folks who do controlled burning, prescribed fire. That is not my wheelhouse. My thing is caution. Please be careful.
Great. What about coconuts?
Coconuts.
I know that the assessment has provided some control measures or some ways to still use coconuts.
Let me look, because I really don't know. It's something that's come up repeatedly. But
yeah, I know that they've come up with some management strategies, and as long as you follow those management strategies, you can still utilize coconuts because it is such a such a big plant for use in South Florida?
Yeah, so I'm seeing it listed as invasive in South Florida, but it's a caution in Central, and it's not a documented problem species in North Florida, right? This is likely an artifact of climate. So definitely in that caution zone in Central Florida, you're going to want to be very cautious to make sure that it's not escaping. I would have to look at any kind of specific like limited approval or limited use recommendations. Those should be available on the website. I don't have that off the top of my head though.
Okay. Let's see. Does IFAS have an app to identify invasives for phones?
No, we don't have a mobile app. The website should work on your phone, but it's not going to be a mobile app. No.
Okay. And can you explain what invasive no uses means?
I mean, simply that there is no kind of approved uses for that plant. It's considered invasive. We don't have any kind of special limited permissions for it. That's just bar none. It's invasive.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate, Christian, I really appreciate you taking the time to answer all these questions, provide this this great resource of information. Know that this presentation is recorded and it will be posted to our website, and it'll reside there. So anytime you want to go back and rewatch it, it'll be available to you. I do also want to remind you that next month the professional webinar is scheduled for November 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern time, and it's going to focus on vines, hanging baskets, and other vertical elements in the landscape. And as you heard Claire say earlier, please make sure you fill out your evaluation that pops up. That is important information to us, gives us an idea of what you want to hear more about. So when we're scheduling out 2024, we'll be able to get those topics that are most important to you. Christian, thank you so much for sharing your morning with us, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for the invite.